Good afternoon, everybody. I am a little bit late on this, but that's okay. So, word of the day is succinct. Succinct means to be briefly and clearly expressed, as in, I prefer a succinct argument to a long and emotional one. I like to give succinct lectures as opposed to long and rambling ones. Uh, in general, not always true, but in general, I try to keep them under 20 minutes, as opposed to standing up and lecturing the entire class period. Saturn's rings, that's our science fact of the day. They were discovered by Galileo in the 1610s when he first looked up into in his telescope. He was actually able to see them. Current estimates say that they're only 10 million to 100 million years old. Now that's a big only, but the reason that's only is because the planet itself has been around for billions of years, and so these rings apparently have come in uh, the last little bit of the planet's lifespan. They're predicted to be around for another 300 million years before gravity kind of pulls them apart. And then finally, they're only 10 meters thick, which is not very much. So I mean, 10 meters thick is about 30 feet. So their thickness is about the size of, you know, your average school, and yet we can see them from uh, billions of miles away because they're so wide. Um, anyway, it's pretty cool. Also, the pictures you're looking at were taken by the Cassini spacecraft, which is the spacecraft that went out to view Saturn. History fact of the day: the Malmuks. Malmuks. Sometimes you'll hear it said Malmaluks, uh, but the Malmuks are basically they were a slave mercenary band that the Arabs and later the Turkish sultans of the Middle East used. And basically, what they would do is they'd go kidnap children. Uh, it was a little bit less of a it was a little bit less forceful sometimes. Most of the time, they'd walk into a village and they'd be like, "Hey, anybody got some kids they don't want?" And they'd give them up. A lot of the times, the people would realize that the kids would be better off joining this mercenary band than living in poverty, so they would give them up. But they basically would go to these like areas, normally Christian, but basically anybody that wasn't Muslim, and they would ask these communities for children. Then they would raise them as essentially mercenary soldiers. They were slave mercenaries, but they used them so extensively that in places like Egypt, they ended up becoming the rulers. So like this guy right here is Muhammad Ali Pasha. He was the ruler of Egypt during the early 1800s. Despite the fact that he was a Malmuk, he was a slave. He was technically a slave to the uh, emperor in the emperor in Constantinople or Istanbul, but he ruled Egypt with basically complete and total power. Uh, so he was a slave technically to the ruler in Istanbul, but since the ruler in Istanbul wasn't immediately there, he was able to act as the essential king of Egypt. So these Malmuks are kind of interesting because they're technically slaves, but they ended up becoming this ruling class in a large part of the Middle East. It's kind of a interesting little era of history. And then finally, we got the book of the day. The book of the day today is actually an author, Alastair Reynolds. I highly recommend him. He's very interesting, got a very interesting way of writing about things. Um, One of the things he does uniquely is he has this like very cool concept of deep time, and so a lot of his books will take place on like a million year order of magnitude, where they're either taking place over millions of years or have implications that stretch out over millions of years. Uh, so it's just kind of an interesting thing. Most like history books and fantasy books and stuff, 10, 20, 100,000 years maybe. He's, got some things that go on for several million years. So like, which one is it? The book, uh, the book, the any of the ones that are like Redemption Arc or Absolution Gap, those are in the same like series, and those are essentially there's this like force that's been around for several hundred million years that knocks out civilizations. And in uh, House of Suns, there are these people that travel around the galaxy, and because of the way ships and Einsteinian time works, they've been around for millions of years. They can like clone themselves and like fix themselves up. They're basically millions of years old. And like, what are the implications of a society that has these people that have lived this long? So anyway, it's an interesting set of books, and I'm going to close there for the day.